Hello everybody, Miss Hoyer back again with another AP Biology video. In this video, we are going to cover topics 8.4 and 8.5, which include all of our different population growth equations that fall under the umbrella of population dynamics. The content provided in this video also follows along with that information, which is contained in Chapter 40 of the Biology in Focus textbook. So as we watch, follow along, stop if you need to, and we will get to learning. So starting off, when we talk about the term population dynamics, we're considering a lot of different things surrounding and focused in on the idea of a population. A population being an ecological term of organization that refers to a group of individuals of the same species. Remember, species means that we can reproduce and produce viable offspring. Very important. We will talk later on in the year about what exactly defines a species, but a good thing to keep in mind for right now. But when we're looking at population dynamics, we're looking at the interactions between populations, and we're looking at the interactions between those populations and the environment, which causes these populations to grow or shrink. So we are looking at variations in population size. Now, we are going to start this lecture by discussing a few of the general terms that we may encounter when dealing with population dynamics. And then we are going to cap it off with the description of how we can calculate the growth of a population and really analyze a lot of these graphs that we're going to see pop up on the AP exam. So starting off, we are going to talk about where populations live and how they live in these areas. When we look at a map, we are going to be looking at populations in terms of their boundaries. So where along the map they are located and their size, how much of the map we are talking about contain these different amounts. When we put those two categories together, the boundary, so the amount of space that we have, and the size, the amount of individuals that we have, we consider the density of our population, the number of individuals per unit area or volume. So if we're dealing with just ground, we may be considering area. So if we wanted to count how many trees exist in a particular environment, we are considering the unit area. If we're considering fish in a three-dimensional lake, we could consider volume, or birds in the sky, or anything that exists on that three-dimensional plane. So area and volume, really, we're not going to have to do any calculations with this, just a good term to know. Because when we know the density of a population, how many individuals live in a particular area, it helps us to identify how its resources are going to be used. So if we have a large number of individuals in a small area, so we have a high density, those individuals are going to be more likely to use up the resources in that area in a much faster period of time. Now, when we go into the field in ecology, we can count the number of individuals that we have in a couple of different ways, and it really depends largely on whether or not those individuals are moving. So we can implant trackers. We can do what's called quadrant sampling, where we lay down a square and we count the individuals within that square, and then we can estimate or extrapolate the size of that population. That way, you don't have to count every single flower in a field. You can count a small number and determine from there what you would expect to find in the rest of the field. So this is going to be the first really application question that I'm going to ask you all. These questions will pop up from time to time, and some of them we will review, some of them will come back in class, but These are things that are designed to get you thinking, to consider what we are looking at on a grander scale. Get those minds ready for those AP Biology questions. So we're going to start this off with a critical thinking question. Species with large body sizes generally have lower population densities, meaning we have fewer individuals in a given area compared with species of smaller body sizes. So think the number of elephants you may find in an area compared to the number of ants that you may find in an area. Why do you think that this might be the case? Try to draw on some previous knowledge and connect in with your previous biology classes to see if you have a good prediction on why this may be the case, and record this in your packet. From here, we are going to talk about mostly population size, or the growth rate of our population, which says how many individuals are being added and subtracted from our population within a period of time. So when we express this mathematically, we're going to use basic algebra. For a lot of these equations that we're going to come across, there are calculus-based options to really getting to the root and the details of these relationships, but we are going to focus only on the algebra-based equations here in class. So when we look at this equation, we consider dn. That D stands for delta, or change in. In math, we use a little triangle to represent change in. In the biology formula sheet, we've exchanged that with just a lowercase d. So the change in our population, and that is divided by our change in time, little t time. Usually this is 1 year. We don't really mess with the time too much, but that entire fraction, the change in population over a change in time, that is your population growth rate. And that is going to be equal to the number of births, or individuals who are added into our population, subtracted by the number of deaths, or individuals removed from our population. Together, individual births, individual deaths, those make up our rate of increase, which we can multiply by our population size. That rate of increase, that little r, is going to be an important factor that will pop up in both our exponential population growth and our logistic population growth to refer to how fast and how many individuals are added to our population within a period of time. So let us start with a hypothetical, because really 90% of the time that is what we're talking about when we're talking about idealized conditions. This is a perfect world. You have no wants, no needs, everything is provided for you. So in these idealized conditions, food and resources are abundant. Individuals reproduce as much as they can, as often as they can, and this creates what we call an exponential population growth. You may recall the term exponential from math class, and we are talking about the same thing. We're just not going to bring any calculus into it. Now, in these types of conditions, our population is going to increase at a constant proportion in each instant of time. And so we get this really steep curve that I've got on the next slide that I'll show you, that our population is ever increasing. We're essentially getting to the point where we are a straight up vertical line. We are increasing so much. And so when we consider the growth rate, that change in population over a change in time for an exponential growing population, we have our rate of change, our R, and that is at a maximum. So our rate of increase is as much as possible. It is our R max, our greatest rate of increase multiplied by our population. So this is looking at a population that is ever increasing. When we look at some examples of questions that you may come across for exponential growth rate problems, they will tell you, do we have an exponential growth? Do we have a logistic growth if you're expected to calculate it? In some cases, maybe not. We're going to look for some key words like exponential growth, rate of increase, our max, and when we get to our logistic problem, I will come back and identify a few keywords that we'll want to look for here. So here is your second application problem for this lecture. This is a math problem, so I am going to ask you to do a little bit of algebra for me. And in this case, we have a population of 2,000 rabbits that is growing exponentially, experiencing a rate of increase of 1.2. If this exponential growth continues, how many rabbits will be added to the population each year? So I am looking for our growth rate here. And for this problem, what I will ask you to do is to, on our Edpuzzle that I'll have this linked on, go ahead and type in your answer and work any calculations that you have. Show your work on your page. Okay, you feel confident in your answer? Let's break this problem down and see if you got it right. So we have an intrinsic rate of increase of 1.2. That is our R. And we have an initial population of 2,000 rabbits. And we are looking for our growth rate, that change in population over a change in time. So we're going to pull out that exponential growth equation. And just like you may be familiar from an algebra class, we are going to plug in the values that we have. We are plugging and we are chugging. We are going to input 1.2 for our max and 2,000 for our initial population. And it is as simple as multiplying those values in order to determine our growth rate over that period of time. So we should have 2,400 individuals added to this population every year if this is our intrinsic rate of growth and we start with a population of 2,000 rabbits. As I said, when we get an increase in that rate, intrinsic rate of increase, we can get up to a vertical slope. So when we are dealing with exponential growth problems, we are going to encounter them as J-shaped curves. So the slope in this case being that rate of increase. So higher rates of increase will have a steeper growth curve, a steeper slope, and lower rates of increase will have a less steep slope. We can usually see this in nature. I know that I mentioned that most of the time we are dealing with this in an ideal hypothetical situation because nothing really truly grows like this. But when individuals experience a catastrophe that greatly decreases their population size, we can see that exponential growth when they are rebounding because we have plentiful resources and we have numerous opportunities to reproduce and fill in this niche within our environment. But the important thing here is that at some point, that population is going to be limited by some factor within the environment. We cannot grow like this forever. We will eventually slow down. And that is where we meet what we call the carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is represented by the variable K. And this is usually the maximum population size that an environment can support given the limited resources. So it can be one resource that's limiting. It can be space. It can be food. It can be whatever. It can be a combination of multiple resources, but something is limiting the size that this population can reach. And so we get that initial exponential growth, what we call the lag phase of our, so we're slow and then we're intrinsically growing. And then as we reach the carrying capacity, our intrinsic rate of increase, our R value, the slope, that's going to decrease. And we are going to kind of even out. A lot of populations will reach this carrying capacity and then we'll enter a little bit of a negative feedback where we may bob up and down beyond that line as we grow, and then we're limited again, and we grow and we're limited again. But overall, in a perfect world, our logistic growth shows this really nice S-curve. So we can see here the comparison between our exponential growth and our logistic growth. You might notice that both of these have the same R values. So we are growing at a certain point at a very similar rate, but in the logistic growth, we are limited by the factors in our environment that say we can't hold more than this set number of individuals, our carrying capacity. So our equation, we take the exponential growth equation and we expand upon it. We add in that factor of the carrying capacity. So we still have our dn, our change in population, over our dt, change in time, our population growth rate. Remember, both of those things together make growth rate. And that is going to equal our rate of increase, our little r, our initial population size, that's our n, and then the additional factor that we have in here is that our carrying capacity minus our initial population divided by our carrying capacity. So these numbers will fluctuate as our population reaches or approaches that carrying capacity. So let's try another application question. And here, obviously, I'm going to ask you guys to use that logistic population growth equation. In this case, we have a hypothetical population of 2,700, and it has a carrying capacity of 3,000 individuals and a rate of increase of 0.8. And we're looking for our growth rate for that population. Just like before, input your answer on the Edpuzzle and write down your calculations on your page, and we'll be back in a moment. Okay, everybody, let's see how we did. Just like before, the first thing that we want to do is we want to identify what values we have. So starting off with our rate of increase, our R value, in this problem we have 0.8. Our initial population is 2,700, and we have a carrying capacity. Remember, we represent that with a K. That is 3,000, and we are looking for our population growth rate. For this problem, we wanted to use the logistic population growth equation, which adds in that carrying capacity value. And just like before, we are going to plug in the values that we were given. So let's start with our rate of increase, 0.8, multiply that by our initial population, 2,700. And then within our parentheses, which means that we want to do this part first, we're going to go carrying capacity minus our initial population size divided by our carrying capacity. Solve for what's in the parentheses first, then multiply everything together, and that should have gotten you to a growth rate of 216 individuals per year. When we consider this equation as a way to represent what is actually happening population-wise on a graph, we consider that our rate of increase is going to be highest when our population is at about half its carrying capacity. So that we have more individuals in our slightly larger population, so we're able to produce more individuals in a shorter period of time until we reach that carrying capacity. Now, all of these logistic growth situations are dealing with things that are limiting factors. And when we consider limiting factors, we may refer to them as growth factors. These are kind of interchangeable terms. Limiting factors, growth factors, whether or not we're looking at how likely a population is to increase or how likely it is to keep a population from increasing. But we have two categories of growth/limiting factors. We have density independent and density dependent. So if we know what the term independent means, independent is all alone by itself, doesn't need anything else. So it is independent of the density of our population. So these are things that can affect our population size regardless of how large or small our population is. These are catastrophic events. Say, or a tornado comes through and wipes out a colony of ants. That tornado did not choose that colony because of how large or how small it was. It was a density independent factor. And when we consider things that are density dependent, these are things that are associated with the density of the population. As the density of the population increases, as our population size increases, we have more likelihood of being affected by this type of factor. So they are dependent on the density of our populations. And I'm going to highlight a couple major ones that your book touches more on. And these are going to include things like competition for resources. So more individuals competing for the same resources, that is a density dependent limiting factor. Disease. Anytime that you have a large number of individuals in a small area, so you have a higher density, it is more likely that disease is going to spread from one individual to another. Kind of a similar idea is predation. So instead of a viral or bacterial infection that is spread between individuals, predation is going to be how likely it is that someone is going to be able to pick one of us off. So if we are all crammed in a small area, much easier in order to get an individual from that population. Then we consider things like territoriality. So a lot of organisms are going to be territorial. They like their space. They like to have a set amount of said space. I like to have a set amount of space. But as we increase in our numbers, the amount of space that you may be able to get gets smaller and smaller. So it may limit how much your population can grow. In addition to these, we've got things like intrinsic factors, how able those individuals are going to be able to deal with each other within that population. And finally, toxic waste. More individuals means more waste. You eat more, you make more waste. So all of these factors altogether are dependent on the density of our population, and these can impact where our carrying capacity sits in terms of the sustainable environment. And as we push over that carrying capacity, those limiting factors will push us back down. So that is our negative feedback. We're going to talk a lot more about negative feedback in the future. But if you are thinking about it in terms of your home's HVAC system, your heating, your AC, you've got a thermostat. Your thermostat is set to 70 degrees, okay? That's your carrying capacity. If you go over 70 degrees, then your AC kicks on and lowers the temperature. If you drop below 70 degrees, you are going to get your heating kicked on, and that increases the temperature. But all of these changes, these fluctuations, these are pulling us back down into that set point, that carrying capacity, in our case, of ecology. We'll have a few different examples of negative feedback pop up later on in the year, but this is a good one as far as ecology goes. And this is where I will wrap up our discussion on population dynamics. Again, if you are interested in having more details or looking into some of these specific concepts, please refer to chapter 40 in the Biology in Focus textbook and ask me any questions that you may want covered in class at the end of this video. And I will see you in the next one.